to the Imaginaries.
Hi, I'm the betrayed look your cat gives you when you feed her chicken and liver instead of chicken and still beating cow's heart, before abandoning her full plate of food for 3 days when you try to starve her into not wasting it, Kedra.
Ooh. And hi, I'm the empty tuna can your ex's cat batted under the stove and is now a viable substrate for toxic fungus. Tony.
Ooh. Well, welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, where we discuss science fiction, fantasy, and all other things imaginary. This week we have a very special episode for you about some very special members of our various families.
Households? Oh,
Households?
Yeah.
Families. Yeah, let's go with that. And we're gonna let Tony kick this one off because Tony has a very special affinity for this particular text and this particular character in this particular text. So, by which I mean, we are talking about Data and the cat Spot in Star Trek, which you can talk about for hours, which is great. We're not going to let you talk about it for hours. We're going to let you talk about it for 45 minutes. Well, actually, not that, because we have 45 minutes for the whole episode. Right. We'll let you talk about it for 5 minutes. How about that?
That sounds great. And lots of cats to get through.
Yes, lots of cats to get through. So give us the ode and then tell us a little bit about its significance.
So here is Data's ode to Spot. Ahem, ahem, ahem. Felis catus is your taxonomic nomenclature, an endothermic quadruped carnivorous by nature. Your visual, olfactory, and auditory senses contribute to your hunting skills and natural defenses. I find myself intrigued by your subvocal oscillations, a singular development of cat communications that obviates your basic hedonistic predilection for a rhythmic stroking of your fur to demonstrate affection. A tail is quite essential for your acrobatic talents. You would not be so agile if you lacked its counterbalance. And when not being utilized to aid in locomotion, it often serves to illustrate the state of your emotion. Oh, Spot, the complex levels of behavior you display connote a fairly well-developed cognitive array. And though you are not sentient, Spot, and do not comprehend, I nonetheless consider you a true and valued friend.
So is that how Data read it in the Star Trek episode?
No, oh my god, Brent Spiner's delivery is way better than I could ever do it. Like, that is not, I mean, Data does not have an emotion chip at that point, so he has no emotions, so he does not deliver it with any particular verve, but his usual rather inquisitive tone, I think is probably the best way to say it.
But let's get into like why this poem has any significance, both like in general and to Star Trek and to Data and to Spot and to us and to this podcast in which we're going to talk a lot about cats in science fiction and fantasy.
Well, let's start with Data and Spot. So Data has a cat. That cat's name is Spot. There are several running jokes throughout Next Generation, both in front of and behind the scenes. In front of the scenes, one of the running jokes was how Spot was never happy with her food, and so Data had hundreds of different, air quotes, feline supplements that he would make to try and appease Spot.
Oh, damn, Scott. Can you imagine how different, like, Macbeth would be if it was Scott instead of Spot?
That would be real different. Also, Scottish? Anyway, one of the jokes behind the scenes, or in front of the scenes, anyway, not in the Star Trek universe, is that Spot...
Beside the scenes.
Spot was referred to as he for, like, several years, and then gave birth on season 7, so, like, they couldn't decide what sex Spot was going to be, which is kind of funny. Spot also gave birth as an iguana, and that episode was kind of strange, so...
Wait, so the cat itself was not pregnant in, like, the cat actor was not pregnant, but the cat in the show gave birth?
I don't know if the cat actor was pregnant, but the cat in the show definitely gave birth, yes.
Okay, that is
Yep.
kind of disturbing. Did not know that.
So the reason why Spot? But Spot is a great way to start us talking about cats in science fiction and fantasy, because Spot is, for me at least, one of the most identifiable cats, one of the most important relationships between a cat and their owner, caretaker.
Yeah, we'll unpack that a little bit. Okay, so we're going to be getting into the relationship between cats and their caretakers, their humans, their alien species, etc. The people, the characters that they own, because they are cats.
Yep.
They are not owned, they own. We're going to be getting into that relationship a little bit because we're really looking to unpack the significance of cats in the story, and usually cats are paired with some other creature, character, owner, owned.
Yes.
In order to demonstrate something about humankind, alien kind, cat kind,
right,
sentience, etc. So what was Spot and Data's relationship trying to unpack?
It's a really good question. Spot and Data's relationship. So I cannot remember off the top of my head if Spot's arrival as Data's cat was ever depicted in the series. I think that Spot just kind of showed up. I know that Spot's first episode was Data's Day, was the name of the episode, so we got to see Data kind of going about his, what 24 hours on the Enterprise was like for him.
Which is a very clever, episode format, I feel like. And that's something, actually, that they brought back in Discovery, isn't it?
Yes. So, Data's relationship with Spot, I think that really the relationship that they were trying to establish, showing Data becoming more human by caring for a pet of some sort, could have really easily been illustrated with a dog, with a fish, with a hamster or something. But they chose a cat specifically because they wanted to see, sort of the sense of Data that they wanted to provide, I think, was Data dealing with a rather unruly creature, a creature that could be, trained to a certain degree, housebroken to a certain degree, but never fully, committed to the sort of prediction that Data really wanted. And not wanted, but the kind of prediction, the kind of predictability that Data had been programmed for. The cat was sort of, a familiar, which we will talk about in a few minutes, that could be unpredictable, that could be irascible, and there are totally words that I'm trying to think of, but unpredictable is probably the best one.
Sure, and enigmatic would be another
good
one.
Yeah,
so that actually provides us with a great sort of intro to one of the guiding questions that I wanted to ask this podcast. So I'm just going to pose it here, and then you can speculate a little bit, or you can just let it sit. It's up to you. But what is, in your mind, the difference between how science fiction casts cats and how fantasy casts cats? Because you talked about how, which is in their familiars, that is probably the most common sort of fantasy cat trope that there is. Whereas I feel like cats in science fiction maybe don't have the same overarching trope. So I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Right. So I think that especially in fantasy and fantastical settings, and I'm saying both of those for a reason, which I will get to in just a moment, but in fantasy and fantastical settings, cats do tend to have this role as a familiar. And I think that that's true when you think of the cats in Harry Potter, especially Crookshanks for Hermione, Mrs. Norris for the caretaker Argus Filch. It's true of Mogget in Garth Nix's Old Kingdom series. It's true of Salem in the Sabrina the Teenage Witch series. It's true to some degree of Hobbes in Calvin and Hobbes. And that's one of the, more the fantastical setting rather than the fantasy, because Hobbes' nature is never explored to the benefit of Calvin and Hobbes. But even, going back to examples like the Cheshire Cat, who kind of played more of a trickster than a familiar, but also, sometimes in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and its many, many interpretations and adaptations through the years, or sometimes entered that role of familiar. And you can see it, we could go through a lot of different examples here. We could go into daemons in general in the His Dark Materials and the Book of Dust series. Specifically, for example, Will's daemon at the end of His Dark Materials settles as a cat. Lord Asriel has a snow leopard as his daemon. Farder Coram, who's really important in the first book, has Sophonax, the cat, as his demon. Beautiful autumn-colored cat. Just, to give you some idea of the range of works we have on this list, we have The Jungle Book, we have The Chronicles of Narnia, we have My Neighbor Totoro, we have American Gods, we have old Beatrix Potter books, we have Buffy the Vampire Slayer, we have BoJack Horseman, we have The Animaniacs. Like, there are lots and lots and lots of different cats we could sort of and try to synthesize for this podcast. Not all of them fall into that role as a familiar, but I think that the idea that a lot of fantasy trucks either in worlds that are kind of offset temporally from our own, like they kind of harken back to this European, vaguely medieval sense, and that a lot of fantasy includes witches, witchcraft, and magic, it's often an easy reach to sort of go to a cat as a companion or familiar for a character in that way. Not to say that it's lazy to do that, not to say that that's a stereotype. I think it's a trope, which is a good thing. But on the other hand, this is finally getting to answer your question. That's not something that you can fall back on as much in science fiction. Certainly there are works that, look at witches or magic in space, or that have settings that are, medieval. Maybe it's a planet that's regressed or an alien population or something. But that sort of same familiarity, literally, where cats sort of occupy that role as magical familiars or companions, doesn't really exist in science fiction as much. Which is not to say it does not exist at all, because that, what's more important, the trope of cat or the trope of fantastical cat in fantasy? And I'm not answering that. I'm not asking that question in the right way.
Well, I don't know that there is a right or a wrong way. I think something that kind of emerges, or has been emerging as you've been talking, is this contrast between tropes in fantasy and something else in science fiction.
Yeah,
and
agreed.
I would kind of take one of your questions, actually, that you put in the show notes today and kind of reframe it a little bit, which is to ask, is what takes the form of a trope in fantasy actually a novum in science fiction? Can we rate cats as part of the science fictional sublime? And is that what makes it feel different from how cats are used in fantasy? Or is that boundary an artificial one that I'm really trying too hard to hammer into place?
Interesting. Okay, well, before we jump into that question, because I think that's a really interesting question to try and answer, let's meet our cast of cats. So if we're thinking about science fiction and cats, some of the cats that we mentioned, Spot, of course, Data's cat from Star Trek, Jonesy the cat from Alien, and a little bit in Aliens. Jonesy has a little cameo at the beginning of Aliens. We have the cat from outer space from the movie The Cat from Outer Space. We have Dandelion from Jean DeWeese's, I don't even know if they were teen or YA or if that made any sense back then. They were from the 80s. I read them a while ago, but Black Suits from Outer Space, and specifically its sequel, The Dandelion Caper. We have Buttercup from The Hunger Games, Prim's cat. We have Dragon from The Rats of Nim, specifically originally Mrs. Frisbee and The Rats of Nim. So we're working with a pretty diverse set of cats. And again, we could mention a lot more, but like those cats, there's a fair bit of difference between Star Trek, The Hunger Games, and Mrs. Frisbee and The Rats of Nim.
And like Lying Cat from Saga. To throw a comic in there. Right.
And we have a couple of comic cats as well. There's Margaret Atwood's Angel Catbird. There's... who else did we have on here? Oh, there's Alarm Cat. What series is that from?
That is from Shudder.
Yeah, that's right. And we have Capo from Catherine M. Valente's recent novel, Space Opera. So again, lots and lots of cats. However, to your question, I don't know that any of those cats are actually novums in and of themselves. I don't think that in any of those examples, a cat is the central new concept, or even a central new concept for a work of science fiction. I will put in a footnote here that says, I would love to be proved wrong. If you have another cat from a work of science fiction that we have not listed here or have not considered, tell us. I would love to know more about cats that are actually novums in science fiction.
Right, and I did read quite a few lists in preparation for this podcast of, like, the best fictional cats and the best science fictional cats and the best fantastical cats. And there are loads of really respectable authors who've included cats in important roles in their books. We're not even going to really touch on, like, Anne McCaffrey and Stephen King and that whole subset of authors, even though they have fantastic cats in their work, and they actually end up creating a fantastical element where there might not have been one before, like, especially in the case of Stephen King's Pet Sematary. It's really, I mean, it's a horror book, but the addition of the talking animals and the undead talking undead animals, I don't know if they talk, actually. I just know that they're undead. The introduction of those undead animals adds, like, a fantastical element. So introducing the cat introduces the weirder, darker elements of the story. So, but we're not really going to talk much about those books, which are more mainstream. We're going to talk a little bit more about things that are clearly science fictional or fantasy.
Right. And so novums, the one way I can think that we might be able to come back around to novums is if we take a minute, and I don't want to do this just yet, but if we take a minute to talk about aliens, extraterrestrials, different species, different sentient species, more specifically, that are based on cats. Yeah,
that's a good and weird one. And I would actually mention a couple of young adult junior fiction level books in here, too.
Yeah.
We brushed over, but, like, it's not just that there are cat-like species in science fictional universes. There are also universes where the talking animals, including talking cats, are the central cast of characters.
Right.
So that would include, I'm thinking most clearly here of Aaron Hunter's Warriors series for young readers, in which it's, I mean, it was touted as a successor to Redwall in a lot of ways, which had, like, the whole range of talking animals, and we talked about Redwall before.
Right.
But in Warriors, it's an entire race of talking cats, and that is the storyline. And that is maybe the closest to being a clear-cut novum.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it really has to come down to that. Like, the cats really have to have a central role. Like, they have to be... I mean, that makes sense when with the way that we use the novum concept. It is the central new idea, or one of the central new ideas. So in order for cats to be a novum, they have to be pretty central. And we can throw in so many different examples of talking cats. I didn't even want to, go too deeply into that particular closet, because we have the entire Disney canon almost to contend with, and then we have Redwall, we have...
Everybody wants to be a cat.
Oh my god, yeah.
The only cat who knows where it's at.
Oh my god, no. Okay, no, I mean, that was fine, that was great, but I don't want to open that door if we can help it, but...
But there's also talking, or possibly not talking, but definitely sentient cats. Like I'm reading J.D. Horn's The King of Bones and Ashes, and it features a cat, Sugar, that maybe it talks, maybe it doesn't. Some people are definitely able to interpret how it lives, but it's not central to the storyline in the same way that the cats are in the Warriors series by Aaron.
Right, and I think that does set it apart. And I put the Sublime on there because we had a really interesting podcast recently, a few episodes back now, where we talked about the science fictional Sublime, and we had, I forget what it was, 3, 4, 5 major points that we ended up hitting on in that episode.
Episode 55. Go back, listen.
Thank you. But the thing that really, really stuck with me, and I think this is going to be something that I return to in the same way that we return to the Novum, is this idea that in the science fictional sublime, science offers you a way both to understand the weirdness and to make sense of the sublime thing that you're seeing, and to understand the sublime thing.
So if you have a cat, like a talking cat or a science fictional cat, somehow the science fiction is allowing you to interrogate its catness in a way that, not like Katniss Everdeen, but it's Katniss with a K, in a way that fantasy isn't, do you think?
Right. Yes. Yep. That's exactly what I was trying to say, and you said it so well. Thank you.
Woo! I did a thing.
Yeah. So, but again, most of the examples that we have on here, Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nin, The Hunger Games, The Cat from Outer Space, The Dandelion Caper, even Data's relationship with Spot on Star Trek, you know, I don't think the cats are really ever... No. Okay, I have a segue here. That episode
very awkward one in which you're like, I have a segue. Here
it like entered my mind like mid-sentence there. So the episode I mentioned where Spot turns into an iguana but still gives birth to kittens, I think in that case Spot actually is kind of the Novum, or at least, you know, fulfills that role of she saves the day, kind of, not necessarily, I don't know if I would call that episode sublime exactly, but they find a way to undo. Basically, the entire crew is, air quotes here, devolving. Like, individually, they're turning back into things that were, you know, I don't know, share common ancestors from their particular planets, and it makes no sense. Don't think about this episode too much. It's kind of more fantastical than it is science fictional. But they solve it by like actually pulling some, like, because Spot has given birth something in the new like the kittens are kittens and not baby iguanas and something. So Spot actually provides the way out. There's a connection.
That is a good connection in that it's there. It's connecting.
It was convoluted.
It was, but I like it. I dig it. Okay,
yeah.
So if we take that as the rare example, and maybe Warriors as another rare example of the cats kind of being the central novum of whatever story.
Yeah.
That's cool. That's great. It's great that they have a novum, but we want to talk about all the cats and all the different roles that they play. So let's maybe dig into a couple of these other cats and how they do or do not illustrate things about the way that science fiction works, the way that fantasy works, the way that comics work. I would start actually with the comics. I want to start with Lion Cat in Saga. Lion Cat in Saga is one of everyone's favorite characters, let's be honest here. If you haven't read Saga before, like, go read Saga and you'll immediately understand why Lion Cat is so iconic and so wonderful as a character. It's the heart of irony, I think, in situational irony, and very obvious irony. I don't know what the other kinds of irony are. I just know situational irony.
Alanis irony.
There you go. So in the storyline, characters are going around being assholes to each other, essentially. And then every now and then, you know, one of them will have this moment where they're trying to convey something to another character. And usually they think they're being sincere, or they know they're being duplicitous, but there's a real emotional heart to the scene. And then Lion Cat pops up and is like, lying. And that's all that Lion Cat says, is lying. Yeah.
Right.
But Lion Cat only says lying when someone is lying. And so what ends up happening is the emotional heart of that moment is kind of punctured, but in a really pleasurable and joy-inducing, maybe not be the right word, in a really interesting and fun way that then allows Saga to do both. It allows it to be sincere and to be freaking hilarious at the same time. So, like, Saga is telling the story of intergenerational conflict, of what do you call it when someone's going after another group of people? Persecution.
Yeah.
where you have groups of people persecuting other groups of people. You have class. You have class conflict. You have interspecial conflict. It's quite dark on a surface level. Yeah. But it also has layers of humor to it. And Lion Cat punctures through all the layers. Whenever it interacts with any of the characters, it manages to turn the emotional pivot of the moment with that character. So Lion Cat is important for that reason. And I think that's an unusual function for a cat in science fiction or fantasy.
Yes. But at the same time, Lion Cat is also very much the Will's familiar. And Lion Cat also kind of transitions from being the Will's familiar to being Sophie's familiar as the series goes on, which is interesting because I totally 100% agree with everything you just said, but there's also kind of that, familiar tropiness to the way that Lion Cat is assigned to interact with other characters. I'm not thinking of the right word either, but there's a familiarity in Lion Cat's relationship to the Will and then to Sophie that lets us see right away, we don't understand how this world works, we don't understand how the universe works, we don't understand, the Will as an assassin early on, we don't understand a whole lot, but right away seeing we don't understand how Lion Cat works as a character until, we get a couple of those moments that you just highlighted. But we understand immediately that the Will and Lion Cat have this relationship where Lion Cat is a kind of a familiar.
Yes, I think that the contrast there, and I mean, I do think that there is a contrast. I don't think I'm making this up, but I could be, let me know. I think that the contrast there is that for familiar, often the familiar makes a person more themselves. Either makes them more comfortable being themselves, or is like a partner in crime, helping the character get done what needs to be done. Right. Whereas in Lion Cat doesn't really do anything except for, tell everyone they're lying. Right. And so, it's not... I mean, there are moments where Lion Cat does more than just, announce that someone is lying. But that's its primary function. Right. And so it's not really a familiar in the sense of, aiding and abetting in that way. It's not making these characters more themselves. It's revealing to these characters their foibles and flaws. Right. And I think that that's really interesting. If Sputnik, my cat, were to, walk up to me one day and just, start calling me on my shit, I would lose my shit. Yeah. It would be great, but it'd also be fucking terrifying. Right. To have something that could tell when you're lying all the time. We don't even realize when we're lying half of the time. White lies, small lies, things like that. And Lion Cat calls characters on all levels of lie. The big ones and the small ones. Right. So, but I like what you're saying about, Lion Cat kind of being an inversion of the trope. That instead of having that relationship of familiarity where where the familiar is really boosting those things or supporting those things in a character, Lion Cat is kind of not tearing them down exactly, but just kind of telling it like it is. Maybe that's a better way to put it, or a more accurate way to put it. Not the greatest sidekick to have with you if you want stuff to get done the way you want it to get done. No. Batman would never get anything done if Robin was just constantly calling him on his shit, which would actually be a great and very interesting show. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'd watch that. Maybe sidekick is an interesting word to explore there. In addition to familiar, I wouldn't necessarily call, I don't know, Crookshanks or Salem or Mogget or Spot. I wouldn't call any of them sidekicks exactly, but maybe what we're looking at in terms of being a familiar, maybe familiar and sidekick, and then some of the other related roles that we might be looking at for some of these cats. Maybe all of those are kind of subsets of a particular relationship that cats tend to occupy. I mean, I could definitely see similarities between Lion Cat and Capo from Catherine M. Valente's space opera, in that I read like half of a chapter from that book about Capo in our space opera podcast. So go back and listen to that if you're interested in hearing more from Capo's voice. I think that Capo is, again, like that kind of ornery, sort of a sidekick, not really doing anything useful, but there to illustrate the absurdity of life, in a sense. They're not fulfilling exactly the same function, and neither of them is exactly useful to the characters whom they are kicking alongside. But they both have, like, that sort of ironic role. The uncovering role. Yeah. But there are also some really problematic cats on our list. I wonder if we could talk about some of the problematic cats.
Yeah, sure.
So, The Jungle Book. We talked briefly about The Jungle Book way back when. I'm not even remembering which podcast it was in. But we did talk about The Jungle Book, especially the live-action adaptation of The Jungle Book, and how it updated the original. And when you talk about kind of classic depictions of cats, when you go to like 18th century and 19th century depictions of the big cats especially, usually they're associated with explorations of the interior of foreign continents. And therefore they're tied to a lot of the problematic tropes of othering that we've talked about, whether it's the alien or so on and so forth. and Jungle Book is a great example of that. Bagheera and the other cats, like, they have elements of like the noble savage trope going. They have elements of the savage going on. And they're usually used to highlight them, like, the qualities which set man apart from nature. Now, that is not as far back as we can go. We can go all the way back to, like, mythology. And there's mythology which is being capitalized on in modern texts, like American Gods has a recasting of Bast. And actually the television adaptation of American Gods even takes that adaptation further, which is interesting. But you have mythologies of
How so? Sorry, can I interrupt? How? What do you mean when you say it takes it further?
Have you watched the television show?
No, I haven't.
Okay, well, I don't want to give away too many spoilers, but Bast plays a slightly more important role, at least compared to what I remember from the book. And the way that the show is shot, every episode starts with kind of a mini-sode featuring one of these gods in their modern struggle to exist. And so you have at least one that focuses on Bast. I believe that there's two. I could be wrong about that. I didn't quite finish the season. I think I got within a couple episodes of finishing and then didn't. But those minisodes do not depict events in the book. They are additions written for the show to kind of give a sense of what life is like today for these individual gods.
Yeah.
And then after the minisode is over, then you pick up the overarching plot line of the entire season, which involves Thursday, Friday, one of the days of the week. I see, this is how long it's been. One of the days of the week is rocking around with the guy from The 100 television show, Ricky Whittle, in an old car. And that's like the overarching plot arc of the series. So that's how American Gods, the TV show, goes in my very amateur, very forgetful summary.
So what were you saying about mythology and Bast?
Okay, so you have the modern interpretations of mythology, which, you know, we can talk about or we cannot. But you also have, underneath those modern interpretations, you have, like, the original myths still peeking through. You have, you do have, like, Bast, and in terms of, like, British European folklore, you have witches and their familiars going way back. In Middle Eastern folklore and mythology, you have cats playing a significant role. And often these myths are problematic on a couple of levels. And I don't know if we've got mythology on our list of podcasts to talk about. Do we?
I
do we
don't
have a
think
mythology
we do.
podcast?
No,
we should probably talk about mythology someday and its relationship to science fiction and fantasy, because that is a whole long conversation that we don't necessarily need to get into today.
Yeah.
But
I'll add it to the list.
We'll add it to the list. So, problematic cats, they go all the way back. They come all the way forward. They are there. Do you have any problematic cats to add to the list?
I don't think so, but I did want to talk for sure about mythology a little bit, just because it seems to me, and I did really cursory searching and am remembering from things that I have looked at, but I'm thinking of various Egyptian mythologies. I'm thinking of various Hindu mythologies, mythologies from the African continent, from the Aztecs, from the Maya, and cats of various sizes and in various guises play roles in a lot of them. And I would, not only is mythology influencing science fiction and fantasy its own podcast, I think we could do an entire podcast that's just mythological representations of cats and how we trace them into modern science fiction and fantasy. However, that podcast is not this podcast. So I'm just gonna give us a little timeout on that one and say that is a really, really interesting area to explore. If you, our lovely listeners, have anything to add as far as cats in mythology and translations into modern science fiction fantasy, we would love to hear about that for potential future podcasts. However, I lied a second ago when I said no to the problematic cats, because we included a couple of works on here by authors who may have been writing specifically about cats. For example, H.P. Lovecraft in The Cats of Ulthar, and Heinlein in The Cat Who Walks Through Walls and To Sail Beyond the Sunset. And so I honestly cannot say with any certainty whether we're looking at cats or cat characters who are problematic in those works, or whether the works themselves kind of come under the same, umbrellas of problematicness that Heinlein, that Lovecraft, that others have been charged with, if you're looking at them from the perspective of modern sensibilities.
Sure. And not to be endlessly self-referential, but we did do an entire podcast on problematic faves. I'm not sure if Heinlein or Lovecraft rate as faves personally for us too, but we did talk about the Chronicles of Narnia, and Chronicles of Narnia does feature another problematic cat, which would be Aslan.
Jesus Lion!
Jesus Lion! So, take that as you will.
Take that as you will. Okay, so I promised several minutes ago that we would talk specifically about alien races or fantasy races that are based on cats. I want to make good on that promise, because this is, apart from folks having relationships with actual cats, like Ripley with Jones, like Data with Spot in science fiction, and then also, all the examples we had in fantasy, I think that the cat-like aliens or the cat-like fantastical races really gives us a potential new area to exploit. So when we're thinking of cat-like races, are there trends that you see? Are there commonalities? Are there threads that really run between those cat-like folks? Why cat-like? What cat qualities do they have?
That's a great question. And there are quite a few cat-like races in science fiction that's a little bit older than the science fiction that I got into when I was, getting into... That is a very convoluted way of saying there's a lot of cat-like races that predate my interest in science fiction.
Yeah.
And several of those races include the Hani from C.J. Chura's Pride of Channer. And again, I'm probably going to butcher some of these names, so if you are fans of these works, please correct me. There's also the Gazinti of Larry Niven's known space novels. There's the Caitians or Cadians.
I've always said Caitians, but I don't know that that's right.
That would make sense to me, the way that phonetically you tend to pronounce the Tian, thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the Cations of Star Trek, which include a crew member in the animated series, Lieutenant Mress, which, if you pronounce that like a meow, it's even better. Mress.
Yeah, yes.
Mress. And then there's the Khajiit of the Elder Scrolls. And I have to admit that I'm not really familiar with the majority of these races.
Yeah.
However, based on their very 80s and very 90s book covers, I think that one of the things that kind of unites them is their otherness. We've talked about in the Jungle Book how the large cats are kind of emblematic of that conversation about the savage and what makes men, what defines man's relationship to nature. Well, if we project that into the future, it makes sense that you would have the same kind of trope just writ large. So you have very operatic depictions of cats.
Right.
Cats with sentience, cats with attitude, cats with fashion. And these cats exist to kind of help give us a backboard, a sounding board for what is human.
Yeah, right. And that's, and you know, you could say, I think you could make the claim that aliens that are based, you know, very strongly on animals from Earth that we recognize have, you know, they're kind of comforting in their familiarity. At the same time, they have that alienness or otherness about them. They're like something that we know, but we don't know it too well. But my follow-up question to that is, how is that different from, say, or rather, how are depictions of cat-like aliens different from depictions of, say, rodent-like aliens, or bug-like aliens, or squid-like aliens, or something?
Well, so anything that's insectile is automatically going to be bad or gross. And cats don't have that creep factor. They have a weird factor. They have an unsettling factor, but they don't have a, like, proboscis and slime factor. They are also, I think, but on a similar level to these other rat-like, insect-like races, they are about race. So when you have a cat-like species in science fiction, you are talking about race when you talk about the characteristics of that species. Like, that is essentially, they are a stand-in for racial difference. And that can be both deeply problematic, or it can maybe be a useful way to talk about, like, real-life race differences and the way that we have traditionally dealt with racial difference, which is not, we don't have a great record. Just to summarize, we don't tend to do very well historically by racial difference. I would speculate, based on my previous experience with Chura, that Chura probably is trying deliberately to comment on how we got things wrong. I mean, this is wild speculation because I haven't read this particular book, but Chura has a fairly refined and nuanced social conscience. And in the hands of someone like that, I tend to trust them with these grand operatic, here's a race of very other weird beings. I tend to trust them a lot more with that than I would, well, not to name any names, but a lot of white middle-aged male traditional science fiction authors. What do you think?
Well, that's an interesting example for one alien race. The Cations, I wish we got to see them more in Star Trek. Star Trek didn't really, in the official canon, really flesh them out very much. The
animated series is official canon. It's just not part of the
live-action
canon.
I know, but we only really saw Mress in like 6 episodes, and she was a background character. So, I mean, we don't really know about the Cations. We saw, one minor recurring character. But when I'm thinking
we do know a lot about squirts.
When I'm thinking of like the Kzinti or that series that you mentioned, the middle grade series with the warrior cats.
Warriors, just call warriors.
Yeah, or even something like Redwall. In all of those examples, cats are kind of cast as the bad guys a lot of the time. And not only the bad guys, but
very common.
Like rapacious killer bad guys. Like, they're warriors, they're gonna fight you, basically. And
they are
possibly
reduced to their hunting instinct.
Right. And that's a really kind of, and I know I've introduced this, more than 40 minutes into the episode, but like this is something that's common enough that I think we should talk about it a little bit, because that does kind of go against the aloofness, the what's the word? Unpredictability of cats.
Enigmaticness.
The enigmaticness, yes, absolutely, that we've kind of been talking about. So cats as warriors, cats as, like, you know, not even necessarily mindless warriors, but, like, you know, going beyond that trope and falling into sometimes a stereotype.
Right.
What is that about? Like, where does that come from?
Well, I think a lot of the texts that we've named here are for younger readers when we're talking about, like, the more hunty, aggressive depictions of cats. And in middle grade junior fiction, specifically, you tend to have a reliance on binaries a little bit more in terms of, like, what makes a character good? They'll be soft and fluffy and cute. What makes a character bad? They'll have teeth and claws. You know,
right.
like, they tend to rely on those so that you can skip over extensive, descriptive, scenic storytelling and world building and get straight to the plot, because a junior fiction reader doesn't have the patience. They don't have the pretty refined frontal lobe that would enable them to enjoy a Kim Stanley Robinson novel, for example.
Of course, but if we're thinking of, like, Redwall as an example, or Larry Niven's Known Space series, like, those are for adults, but they still do that same kind of work. So,
however, I think that we tend to grow up with these texts, and we tend to forgive is the wrong word. We tend to allow them emotional weight in our lives long past the original, like, intended audience. And I would say Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim is one of those texts for me personally. Like, this is a book that I read when I was probably like 8. But it's still really important to me, and it is relying on these exaggerated stereotypes of the various animals. The exception being that rats are good in this book, but like mice are good, cats are bad, birds are bad, you know, with a very few exceptions. And so they're relying on, like, predators equal bad, scavengers and herbivores good, which is actually kind of how Redwall swung it as well.
Oh yeah, totally. And I feel like that's something that you see a lot of, unless the good guys, quote unquote, are, you know, from a predator species, like in The Lion King, where the good guys are carnivores, but the bad guys are also carnivores.
Yes, so and that is true for Warriors. Warriors has hero cats, and it also has villain cats. Pretty practical. I highly recommend this series. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I think that a great text to kind of provide us with, and maybe a couple of points of resolution about this particular thing is Harry Potter, because you have two cats enacting very different personalities and very different roles. You have Crookshanks, who is kind of like ugly, but is like a good cat. It does good by its human. And then you have Mrs. Norris, who is like the extension of the caretaker's miserable, disgusting, gross, malicious personality. And so within the one text, you have the two extremes. And I think that that's really interesting. So when you think about Harry Potter and how it has both, what do you see as being the advantage to doing both? Do you see it as adding nuance? Do you see it as giving us kind of an outro to this conversation about the negative versus the positive depictions?
Well, I appreciate that you said that they're both ugly, because you are right about that, and I totally didn't think about that until right now. Like, Crookshanks multiple times is referred to as, like, squash face, like, run into a brick wall. Mrs. Norris is, like, I think dusty colored, like, she is, you know, kind of, it's implied that she's been around for a long time, and she's as ill-tempered as Filch is. So having, you know, there's nothing quite as simplistic as Crookshanks is a beautiful kitten who Hermione, you know, tied bows around his neck. Not that Hermione is the kind of character to do that, but it's nice that you don't have that particularly obvious juxtaposition. But at the same time, you know, it's interesting that both cats are pretty intelligent as well. Like, Mrs. Norris kind of knows when trouble is happening, and she can show up very quickly. Crookshanks, in the third book, communicated with Sirius Black when he was a dog, so Crookshanks understood that there was something more going on there, and then tried to capture Pettigrew when he was in his rat form. So both cats are kind of ugly, both cats are very intelligent, both cats kind of have different allegiances, but not necessarily... Like, we never get the sense that Crookshanks is going to, I don't know, fight Voldemort. Side note, I want that scene now. But
Here for it.
Yeah, and in the same way, like, Filch is never bad, exactly. Mrs. Norris is never bad in the same way that Harry Potter goes out of its way to, like, say that Voldemort and his Death Eaters and those who follow them are bad, capital B, bad. So... yeah, I think that actually, and unexpectedly, we get this nuanced treatment of the roles that cats can play in fantasy and science fiction by seeing these side cat characters and by seeing them juxtaposed with each other in a single text, the Harry Potter canon, which we don't really see otherwise. Like, all of the other cats on our list, from Lion Cat down through Mogget, Hobbs even, Aslan, Jones from Alien, Spot, Data's cat, Buttercup in the Hunger Games, Dragon, and Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nim. They're all singular. This is the cat in the work.
Yes.
And by seeing multiple cats in a work, we can kind of see what the tropes are and see how they're maybe leaning more towards the stereotypical side. Are these cats kind of aloof and enigmatic familiars? Are they rapacious killing machines that'll claw you apart as soon as they look at you? Are they something else entirely? I think those are probably the two big tropes that we've come away with. But by seeing multiple cats together, we get what can be a little more than just that.
Yeah, and, like, cats are, as you pointed out in our show notes, like, they're pretty well represented across genres and across media. Like, comics have them, movies have them, TV shows have them, regular books have them, in both science fiction and fantasy subgenres, which is pretty cool. Like, they're everywhere, and I think that they're everywhere because in the real world, they're everywhere. Like, everyone is fascinated, and, like, both of us are, owned by cats.
Yeah.
We have cats in our lives, and they have us in theirs. And there is something unknowable about the cats in the real world, and I think sometimes we try to, like, work that out a little bit in maybe fun ways when we're feeling light and fun, and maybe serious ways when we're feeling real serious in our books that we write and we read. And, like, there are definitely moments when I'm like, oh, I recognize that cat behavior.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Nostalgia, recognition, love it. And I think that that's, like, one of the things that makes science fiction and fantasy fun is we get to make those moves for no particular reason, but they do lend to personality, and then sometimes we're able to, like, work that into an important plot point. Yeah. I don't know that Jonesy ever gets to be an important plot point, but he definitely serves to kind of provide a counterpoint or, like, a softness to Ripley's character that wouldn't have been there otherwise. Like, there's a... That is... I mean, it's Aliens, right? When he shows up, the second movie?
No, it's the first one.
Oh, it's the first one.
Yeah.
But it's something to protect. It's something that's not mechanical on the ship. It's something that provides a softness, and that's an important thing to bring into a story in which you're later going to try and make Ripley maternal, which is kind of interesting. So it's kind of foreshadowing there. And surprisingly, Jonesy, like, survives. This badass cat somehow survives like 60 years on the ship without being frozen. So that is a badass cat.
Jones was frozen with Ripley.
Oh, he was frozen?
Yeah.
Well, it's still pretty impressive that a cat could survive, like, a human-designed...
that's true. Yeah, that's
crash
very
couch.
true. Yeah.
So let's kind of start angling towards a way out. So, like, your most central question here, the thing that's kind of been underpinning a lot of our conversation is, like, why cats?
Yeah.
What is it about cats that keeps begging for representation in science fiction and fantasy, especially cats opposed to anything else.
Right.
Because they're everywhere.
Yeah.
And, like, dogs are everywhere, too, and I get that,
Right.
but, like, we don't care much about dogs right now, so we're talking about cats.
Right, and we may have a future podcast that's about dogs in science fiction.
Marley and me! Oh, wait, that's not sci-fi.
But I think part of it, for me at least, and this is not going to be a grand sweeping statement about all science fiction or all fantasy, or even, a small subset of it, but for me, for example, we had a
Hashtag
podcast
not all cats.
about... We had a podcast about libraries and librarians. And one of the reasons why I'm drawn to libraries and librarians in science fiction and fantasy is that libraries were really important to me when I was a kid. That's where I found a lot of books. I liked reading a lot. Librarians were very friendly and they helped me out. So I, a lot of the time when I'm writing then, I include libraries and librarians as characters. And I think that that's true of a lot of writers who found a home in libraries, who found, kind librarians who would get things for them. And I know I just thought I wasn't going to make a grand statement, and I made one about libraries and librarians. But
which, thank you.
Right. I want to make a parallel statement for cats, that whether or not a person owns a cat, whether or not they had a family cat or family cats growing up, part of my cat canon now is having grown up with Salem making snarky remarks on Sabrina the Teenage Witch, of, knowing the Cheshire Cat's grin as its body faded away, having Mogget be the companion to Sabriel and then to Lyriel in the Old Kingdom, reading the Dandelion Caper, like I said, catching the cat from outer space on, like, Turner Classic Movies when I was a kid. Like, those works really helped to solidify for me that cats are an important part of science fiction and fantasy, more so than my own interactions with the lovely cats in my life, and they have been very, very lovely cats. But I am made by the works that have featured cats before me, and I would be more likely to feature cats in my own work because of Salem, because of Mogget, because of Jonesy. So there's a history there for me, and I wonder if others don't feel the same, that there's, this great big cathedral of cats in science fiction and fantasy, that, like, everyone just wants to create a cat so they can hang out in that cathedral with all the cats that have gone before them.
Which is, like, fair enough, but I think that there's something else underlying what you're saying. Like, it's not just that you were made by texts that happen to feature cats in them. There is something about the cat in those texts that intrigued you all along.
Oh, yes.
And maybe that thing is the other, but a less frightening other, a less alien other.
Yes.
Something that's semi-accessible to us because it does have its roots in real life.
Right.
Something that's a little bit less gross and icky than an insectoid other or a racialized other. It's less problematic than a racialized other, definitely. So we are, as humans, we are preoccupied with things we can't understand. Right. And we can't understand cats. I mean, we think sometimes that we can understand cats. Yeah. We can definitely understand cats, like, when they're looking at us like Sputnik is right now, where she's like, you've been talking for a really long time and not putting food in my mouth. Come on. Like, we can understand the basic cat needs, but there is something, as we've used this word many times in the podcast already, enigmatic about this.
Yes.
And there's something enigmatic about the ocean, which is why the ocean shows up in so many fucking books.
Right. And space, for that.
And space. Matter. So the combination of space and cats, like, there are kids' comic books now that are basically about space cats, which is great. And there's also space dinosaurs, which I totally get.
Lovely.
Space dinosaurs and cats would be the perfect mix. Just somebody out there, take this idea, run with it, go for it, make that thing. I will love it. I will give you my money. I will throw my money at you if you do space dinosaurs and cats. So,
ouch.
But, like, my point is that we're preoccupied with these things we can't understand, that are unreachable, that are enigmatic, and cats happen to be one of those. They're maybe not the top of the pantheon, but they're there snarkily hiding underneath the pantheon going, I'm not leaving, I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, well said.
So, thank you. Not as well said as your last statement. I just kept going until I found something good.
No, that was more well said.
You steal my words.
That was more well said than my last statement. So I think we can agree that those are our last statements, and we stand by them.
BFF.
Hard.
Aww. Okay, so Tony,
Yes.
if our if our listeners have survived this long through a podcast about cats, where can they find more weird ramblings by us?
So, you're looking for more of us. You can find us wherever you downloaded this episode, whether that happens to be iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, whatever app you use for podcast downloads. Our episodes are on all of those platforms. Unfortunately, our back episodes are only available on YouTube, so if you're listening to this more than 6 months after we record it, so sometime after the early months of 2019, you're probably on YouTube. So check those out, listen to our back episodes, check out our website at imaginaries.net, where we have all of our episodes listed, where we have reviews, where we have links to our videos up on YouTube, both back episodes of podcasts and the videos we produce specifically for YouTube. We are also on Twitter at imaginary_pod. And then you can email us at imaginarypod@gmail.com.
Thank you for that. And just like to kind of circle back a very little bit, it's worth reiterating, as always, that Tony has been producing some spectacular new videos that are not podcasts, but
not podcasts,
but are related to the science fiction and fantasy that we talk about on the podcast. So we are calling these the Imaginary Guides to X. We have at least 3 up right now as of this particular podcast. Highly recommend that you go and dig those out. The second half of the season 1 commentary on Star Trek is brilliant and features, what's the song? The song.
Oh, Yakety Sax.
Yakety Sax, and a lot of ensigns dying to the sounds of Yakety Sax. So definitely check those out on YouTube. We are providing links to them on our website as well, and of course on our Twitter. Twitter is the most reliable place to find us. So go find us on Twitter. Mm-hmm. And if you're a cat listening to this episode, I just want to say, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I fucked up so many times. I love you. You're great.
Oh. And I want to say, nice job.
Nice job. Bye.
Bye.
Sputnik, do you want to weigh in?